Driving at night had always been therapeutic for me. There was something calming about the empty roads, the hum of the engine, and the soft glow of headlights cutting through the darkness. But one night in early November 2021, I learned how quickly that peaceful solitude can turn into something out of a nightmare. I was on my way back from a weekend trip visiting an old college friend in a small mountain town. The drive home was supposed to take about 3 hours, but thanks to some last-minute errands, I hadn't left until nearly midnight. By the time I hit the highway, the roads were deserted, the surrounding landscape cloaked in darkness. For the first hour, everything was fine. I had my favorite playlist on, a cup of coffee in the holder, and the highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon. But as I left the main road for a more rural route, things started to feel different. The first thing I noticed was the fog. It rolled in suddenly, a thick wall of gray that seemed to swallow the road ahead. My headlights barely cut through it, and the trees on either side of the highway dissolved into shadowy silhouettes. I slowed down, leaning forward in my seat to see better, when I noticed something strange. Up ahead, standing on the shoulder of the road, was a man. He was tall, wearing a long coat that flapped faintly in the wind. His head was tilted down, obscuring his face, and his arms hung loosely at his sides. At first, I thought he might be a hitchhiker, but as I got closer, I realized he wasn't holding out his thumb or signaling for help. He was just standing there. I passed him slowly, my pulse quickening as I glanced at his face. It was pale, almost gray, and his eyes. There was something off about them, though I couldn't put my finger on it. As my car crept past, he turned his head to follow me, his gaze locking onto mine through the passenger side window. I didn't stop. The unease settled deep in my stomach as I drove on, glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure he wasn't following me. But the fog was so thick that he disappeared from sight almost immediately. For the next few miles, I tried to shake the encounter, telling myself he was just some drifter or someone stranded on the road. But the nervous energy lingered, and I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again. This time, he was standing directly in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, my tires screeching on the damp asphalt as the car skidded to a stop just feet from where he stood. He didn't move. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at him through the windshield. His face was clearer now in the glow of the headlights, gaunt and emotionless, his eyes dark and unblinking. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide and unnatural, his teeth too perfect and his lips curling in a way that made my skin crawl. I honked the horn, but he didn't react. He just stood there, smiling, as if daring me to move. I reversed the car, my hands shaking as I backed up to a safe distance. When I glanced up again, he was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur of panic and paranoia. The fog seemed thicker than ever, and every shadow on the side of the road looked like him. When I finally pulled into a rest stop, the place was deserted. I parked near the entrance, keeping the engine running as I tried to catch my breath. I was scrolling through my phone, debating whether to call someone, when I saw movement in the corner of my eye. He was standing under a street lamp near the edge of the lot, his figure barely visible through the fog. I locked the doors, my fingers trembling as I turned on the headlights. The beam illuminated him fully now, his smile wider than before. And then, without warning, he started walking toward the car. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the slick pavement as I backed out of the lot. The man didn't run, but his steps were quick and deliberate, closing the distance between us far faster than they should have. When I finally pulled onto the highway, he stopped, standing in the middle of the road and watching as I sped away. I didn't stop again until I reached the safety of my driveway. Even then, as I turned off the engine and sat in the car, the image of his face lingered in my mind. I checked the rearview mirror compulsively, half expecting to see him standing at the edge of the yard. But the driveway was empty. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I drove at night, I found myself scanning the side of the road, bracing for the sight of him. And sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, I still hear faint footsteps outside my window. But when I look, there's never anyone there. Driving at night had always been a necessity for me. Between a demanding job and a busy life, I often found myself on empty roads after sunset. It never bothered me until one particular night in 2019, when an ordinary trip became a haunting memory I'll never forget. I was driving back from a family gathering in a small town about 3 hours away. The event had stretched longer than expected, and it was almost midnight when I finally hit the highway. The road was deserted, the occasional distant glow of headlights the only sign of life. For the first hour, the drive was peaceful. My playlist hummed in the background, and the open road stretched endlessly before me. Then, somewhere along the winding stretch of highway that cut through a forest, I saw them. A pair of faint taillights appeared ahead, bobbing slightly as the vehicle navigated the uneven road. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just one car. It was a convoy, a line of vehicles moving slowly and steadily, almost too perfectly synchronized. The first car was a beat-up pickup truck, its bumper hanging loose and its paint faded. Behind it was a sedan, then a station wagon, and at the rear, a large, boxy van. I slowed down to match their speed, debating whether to pass. Something about the way they moved made my skin crawl. Each car stayed perfectly in line, maintaining an exact distance from the one in front of it. There was no weaving, no hesitation, just a slow, methodical procession. I decided to overtake them. As I passed the first car, I glanced at the driver. He was sitting completely still, his hands on the wheel and his gaze fixed straight ahead. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes unblinking. It was the same with the second car, and the third. By the time I passed the van at the rear, my stomach was in knots. Something wasn't right. I sped up, eager to put some distance between me and the convoy. But as the miles ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart sank. The convoy was there, their headlights glowing faintly in the distance. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd sped up after I passed them. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. But the unease in my chest grew with every passing minute. The convoy stayed the same distance behind me, never gaining, never falling back. Then, the headlights disappeared. One moment they were there, a steady glow on the horizon. The next, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I slowed down, my pulse quickening as I scanned the mirrors. The road behind me was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A few minutes later, I saw them again, this time ahead of me. The convoy was back, moving at the same slow, synchronized pace. I slammed on the brakes, my hands gripping the wheel. There was no way they could have gotten in front of me, not without passing me on the road. I sat there, the engine idling, my headlights illuminating the rear van. Then, one by one, the vehicles began to turn off the road. The pickup truck was the first, veering smoothly onto a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the forest. The sedan followed, then the station wagon, and finally the van. I waited, my heart pounding, until the last set of taillights vanished into the trees. When I was sure they were gone, I pressed the gas and drove on, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. The road ahead was empty for a while, and I began to convince myself it was over. But about 20 minutes later, the headlights reappeared. This time, they were much closer. I sped up, my chest tightening as the lights grew brighter in the rearview mirror. They weren't swerving or flashing, just following, steady and unrelenting. I tried to lose them, taking sharp turns and speeding down side roads. But no matter where I went, the convoy stayed on my tail. Finally, I spotted a gas station up ahead, its neon sign glowing faintly in the distance. Relieved, I pulled into the lot and parked near the entrance. The convoy didn't follow. I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling as I approached the store. The clerk looked up as I entered, raising an eyebrow. "You all right?" he asked. "There was a group of cars following me," I said, glancing over my shoulder. He frowned. "Did you see their plates?" I shook my head, realizing I hadn't paid attention. The clerk leaned against the counter, his expression serious. "You're not the first person to say something like that. People talk about strange convoys on this road. Cars that appear and disappear, drivers who don't look normal. What happens to them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The clerk hesitated. Most people don't stick around to find out. I thanked him and left, my nerves on edge as I climbed back into the car. The lot was empty, the road silent. I drove cautiously, my eyes darting between the mirrors and the dark expanse ahead. For a while, it seemed like the convoy was gone. But just as I began to relax, my headlights caught movement on the side of the road. One of the cars, the van, was parked in the ditch, its engine idling and its driver's seat empty. As I slowed down, the van's headlights flicked on, blinding me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as the other vehicles appeared behind me, their lights illuminating the road like a sinister procession. The convoy had boxed me in. The van began to back up, inching closer as the other cars closed the gap from behind. I had nowhere to go. In a panic, I swerved onto the shoulder, narrowly missing the ditch as I sped past the van. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the line of cars, their headlights flickering out one by one until the road was dark again. I didn't stop until I reached home, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that road, but sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I catch a glimpse of faint taillights in the distance, and I wonder if they're waiting for me to follow. Driving at night was never an issue for me. I liked the quiet solitude of the open road, the faint hum of the tires, and the rare freedom of empty highways. But one night in 2020, I learned how quickly the road can turn into a nightmare. I was on my way back from a weekend camping trip with friends. The drive home should have been straightforward, 3 hours on the interstate, then a short detour onto a rural road to cut through some farmland. My GPS marked the route clearly, and with the late hour, I expected no traffic. The first 2 hours passed uneventfully. The interstate was a long stretch of black asphalt lit by the occasional passing car. The monotonous drive had lulled me into a state of calm, but as I approached the exit for the rural shortcut, my GPS began to glitch. The cheerful voice guiding me suddenly fell silent, the map freezing on the screen. I tapped at it, trying to refresh the route, but the screen remained locked. "Great," I muttered, glancing at the sign for the exit. It was unfamiliar, marked County Road 53, but I figured it was the right one. The route had looked straightforward earlier. I took the exit, turning onto a narrow road that disappeared into the darkness. At first, everything seemed fine. The road was quiet, the headlights cutting a clear path through the shadows. But after about 10 minutes, I started to notice something strange. The GPS still wasn't working, and I hadn't seen a single street sign since leaving the highway. The road was supposed to connect back to the interstate after a few miles, but instead, it stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense trees that seemed to grow taller with every passing minute. I slowed down, unease creeping into my chest. That's when I saw the first sign. It was an old, rusted road sign leaning crookedly on the side of the road. The words were faded and nearly illegible, but I could just make out the letters, "Wrong way." I frowned, glancing at the GPS again, but it was still frozen. Had I made a wrong turn somewhere? As I debated whether to turn back, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance behind me. Relieved, I slowed down, hoping to flag the driver for directions. The car was moving slowly, its headlights flickering faintly, but as it got closer, something felt off. The headlights were uneven, one brighter than the other, and the car itself seemed old and battered, its hood dented and its paint peeling. The unease deepened when the car slowed to match my speed, its grille nearly touching my rear bumper. I pressed the gas, trying to put some distance between us, but the car sped up to match me. For the next few miles, it followed close behind, its headlights glaring in my mirrors. I could just make out the driver's silhouette, a shadowy figure slumped low in the seat. "Come on, pass me," I muttered, but the car didn't budge. It stayed behind me, its headlights pulsing like a heartbeat. Finally, I spotted a small dirt road branching off to the left. I took the turn abruptly, my tires kicking up gravel as I tried to lose the car. The road twisted and turned, the trees pressing closer until their branches nearly scraped the windows. For a moment, I thought I'd lost my pursuer. Then I saw the headlights again. They appeared in the rearview mirror, bobbing unevenly as the car navigated the rough terrain. Panic surged through me as I pressed the gas, the engine roaring as the car sped down the narrow path. The headlights grew closer, their glow illuminating the interior of my car. I risked a glance in the mirror and froze. The driver was gone. The car behind me was empty. Its headlights shone brightly, its engine roared, but there was no one behind the wheel. I tore my eyes away from the mirror, my hands gripping the wheel as the road suddenly widened, opening into a clearing. Ahead of me, a large wooden sign loomed. Its words burned into the wood. "Welcome back." I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the clearing. The car behind me did the same, its headlights cutting out abruptly. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I glanced around, trying to make sense of where I was. The clearing was surrounded by trees, their branches bare and twisted like skeletal arms. And then I heard it, a faint tapping on the passenger side window. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to look. A man was standing there, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes unblinking. "Roll it down," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. I shook my head, fumbling to put the car into gear. But before I could move, he spoke again. "You can't leave," he said, his lips curling into a smile. "Not yet." The engine roared to life as I floored the gas, the tires kicking up dirt and debris. The man didn't move, but as I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. The car that had been following me, the one that was empty, was now parked in the clearing, and the man was sitting in the driver's seat, watching me with that same unsettling smile. The road twisted and turned, the trees blurring into dark streaks as I drove as fast as I could. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the GPS flickered back to life, guiding me back to the main highway. When I pulled onto the familiar stretch of road, I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. But the relief was short-lived. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them again, the headlights. They followed me all the way home, disappearing only when I turned into my driveway. To this day, I don't know what happened on that road, but sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is still, I hear the faint hum of an engine outside my window, and I wonder if they're waiting for me to take the wrong exit again. Driving at night was something I used to enjoy. The solitude of the open road, the hum of the engine, and the peaceful stillness of the world made it my favorite time to travel. But after what happened one fateful winter night, I've never driven in the dark again. It was late January 2022, and I had just attended a weekend reunion with some old college friends. The gathering was held at a cabin deep in the woods, about 4 hours from my home. Because of work obligations, I didn't leave until nearly 10 p.m., knowing I'd be driving late into the night. The first hour of the drive was uneventful. Snow lined the shoulders of the highway, reflecting the glow of my headlights, while the occasional oncoming car sent fleeting bursts of light through the dark. But as I veered onto the smaller state road that led through the forest, a heavy fog began to roll in. At first, it was just a thin mist, swirling at the edges of the road. But within minutes, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I slowed down, leaning forward in my seat to peer through the windshield. The high beams were useless, reflecting the fog back at me in a blinding haze. I gripped the wheel tightly, my unease growing with every passing mile. That's when I saw him. A figure emerged from the fog, standing on the shoulder of the road. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a dark coat. His face was obscured, his head tilted slightly downward, but as I passed, he lifted his head to look at me. I only caught a glimpse of his face, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. His expression was blank, his skin pale, and his eyes seemed to glint unnaturally in the headlights. As I drove past, I couldn't resist glancing in the rearview mirror. He was gone. My heart raced as I pressed the gas, eager to put distance between myself and whatever, or whoever, I had just seen. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a stranded traveler waiting for help. But the unease lingered, settling in the pit of my stomach like a heavy stone. Then, about 10 minutes later, I saw him again. This time, He was standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding on the icy pavement as the car came to a halt just a few feet from him. The man didn't move. He stood there, his head tilted and his arms hanging loosely at his sides. I honked the horn, but he didn't react. "Do you need help?" I called out through the cracked window, my voice shaky. He slowly turned his head to face me, and for a moment, our eyes met. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was too wide, too unnatural, and it sent a chill down my spine. I reversed the car, putting as much distance between us as I could. When I looked forward again, the road was empty. The man was gone. I sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. The eerie smile burned into my memory. Finally, I started the car again, determined to get home as quickly as possible. But the fog seemed thicker now, pressing against the windows and reducing my visibility to almost nothing. And no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The next sign of trouble came about 20 minutes later, when my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message or an alert about the weather. Instead, it was a single text from an unknown number: "Slow down." My blood ran cold as I stared at the message. How could anyone know I was speeding? I checked the rearview mirror again, but the road behind me was empty. Trying to shake off the growing fear, I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head, and there he was, the man from the road. He was standing in the woods, barely visible through the trees, his pale face glowing faintly in the dark. My foot pressed harder on the gas, the car roaring as it sped down the road. But no matter how far I drove, the fog remained, and so did the man. I finally spotted a gas station up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the lot, parking near the entrance. The station was empty, the building dark except for a single bulb above the door. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin as I hurried inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the quiet. There was no response. As I turned to leave, I saw him again. The man was standing at the edge of the parking lot, his figure barely visible through the fog. My heart pounded as I scrambled back into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine. When I looked back, he was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur of fear and paranoia. Every shadow looked like him. Every sound made my heart race. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the empty street, trying to convince myself it was over. But as I stepped out of the car and looked back, I saw them, footprints in the snow, leading from the road to my front door. I've always believed that the scariest things happen when you least expect them. For me, that belief became a chilling reality during a routine night drive home in the winter of 2021. I had spent the evening at a friend's house in a nearby town. We'd gotten caught up in reminiscing and lost track of time, so by the time I left, it was well past midnight. My drive home was supposed to be an hour-long trip along a quiet, rural highway. The first part of the drive was uneventful. The snow-covered road reflected the faint glow of my headlights, and the radio hummed softly in the background. I'd driven this route dozens of times, so I wasn't too concerned about the late hour or the occasional patch of fog rolling across the road. But about 20 minutes into the drive, I saw something, or rather, someone, that made my stomach tighten with unease. It was a woman, standing on the side of the road. Her figure appeared suddenly out of the fog, illuminated by the car's headlights. She was wearing a long coat and what looked like a dress underneath. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if she were cold. I slowed down as I approached, my heart pounding. Picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of the night was the last thing I wanted to do, but leaving her out there alone didn't feel right either. I pulled over and rolled down the passenger side window. "Are you okay?" I called out. She didn't respond at first. She just stood there, her hair hanging over her face. Then, slowly, she raised her head to look at me. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. "Can you give me a ride?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and gestured for her to get in. "Thank you," she said, climbing into the seat. Her movements were slow, almost hesitant, and she winced slightly as she sat down. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just up the road," she replied, not meeting my eyes. Her vague answer made me uneasy, but I didn't press her. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the soft hum of the heater. Every so often, I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She was staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Something about her didn't feel right. "Are you from around here?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She hesitated before answering. "No." Her short reply made the air in the car feel heavier. I decided to focus on the road, counting down the minutes until I could drop her off. That's when I noticed something odd. The dashboard clock had frozen. It was stuck at 12:37, even though I knew at least 10 minutes had passed since she got in. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced at the woman again. Her posture hadn't changed, but her face looked different. Her skin seemed paler, her features sharper, and her eyes looked black in the dim light, as if they'd absorbed all the color. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. "You said it wasn't far. How much longer?" She turned her head to look at me, and for the first time, I noticed a faint, unsettling smile on her lips. "We're almost there." Her words sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't know where there was, but I had no intention of finding out. Up ahead, I spotted a gas station with its lights still on. Without thinking, I pulled into the lot and parked near the entrance. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I need to grab something real quick," I said, trying to sound casual. She didn't respond, but I could feel her eyes on me as I stepped out of the car. The moment I was inside the gas station, I approached the clerk, a tired-looking man in his 40s. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low. "There's a woman in my car. She says she needs a ride, but something about her, it doesn't feel right." The clerk's expression darkened. "What woman?" I turned to point toward my car, but my breath caught in my throat. The passenger seat was empty. I ran back to the car, yanking the door open. There was no sign of her, no footprints in the snow, no lingering warmth in the seat. It was like she had vanished. Heart pounding, I got back in and locked the doors. The clerk watched me from the window, his face pale and drawn. I didn't wait to explain. I pulled out of the lot and sped down the highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. For a while, the road was empty, the fog thinning as I drove. I began to convince myself it was over, that my mind had been playing tricks on me. But then, in the rearview mirror, I saw her. She was sitting in the back seat, her black eyes locked on mine. "Why did you stop?" she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. I swerved, nearly losing control of the car as I turned to look. But the back seat was empty. The rest of the drive was a blur of fear and adrenaline. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I sat in the car for a long time, afraid to move, afraid to look in the mirrors. I haven't driven that route since, and sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is still, I hear her voice. "Why did you stop?" Driving at night had always been second nature to me. As a traveling photographer, long stretches of road often defined my life, and I'd grown to enjoy the solitude of it all. But one winter night in 2021, a routine drive turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. I was heading back from a photo shoot in a remote mountain town. It had been snowing lightly all day, and by the time I left, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. Heavy flakes blanketed the winding road, and the sky was an inky black, void of stars. My GPS assured me that the highway ahead would lead me home, but as I soon discovered, not every road is meant to be traveled. The first 2 hours of the drive were uneventful. The snow muffled everything, creating an eerie silence that was both calming and unsettling. The occasional oncoming car passed me by, their headlights cutting briefly through the darkness. Then, somewhere along the isolated stretch of highway, I noticed something odd. The mile markers were out of order. One sign read mile 42, but just a few minutes later, I passed one marked mile 12. At first, I thought I must have misread them. Maybe the snow was obscuring the numbers, or maybe I was just tired. But as I drove on, it became clear that the markers weren't random. They were moving backward. Mile 8, mile 3. By the time I passed mile 1, I was thoroughly unsettled. I glanced at the GPS, hoping for some clarity, but the screen was frozen. The map stuck on an unchanging stretch of road. That's when I saw the car. Its headlights appeared suddenly in the distance, moving slowly, almost hesitantly. As I got closer, I realized the car was parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing faintly in the snow. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. The car was an older model, a rusted sedan, and its windows were completely fogged up. I rolled down my window slightly, the cold air biting at my skin. "Hello?" I called out. No one answered. I sat there for a moment, debating what to do. The storm was worsening, and the thought of someone stranded out here alone made my stomach churn. Reluctantly, I pulled over and stepped out of the car. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I approached the sedan, my breath visible in the frigid air. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The car's windows weren't just fogged. They were iced over, as if it had been sitting here for days. Yet the engine was running, a faint plume of exhaust rising from the tailpipe. I knocked on the driver's side window. "Hey, are you okay?" No response. I tried the door, but it was locked. Peering inside, I could just make out the shape of someone sitting in the driver's seat, their head tilted down as if they were asleep. I knocked harder, the sound echoing in the stillness. "Hello? Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept down my spine. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to leave. As I turned to head back to my car, I froze. The hazard lights had stopped flashing. The eerie silence was broken only by the soft sound of falling snow. My heart pounded as I hurried back to my car, fumbling with the keys. I climbed in, locking the doors and gripping the wheel with trembling hands. When I looked up, the sedan's headlights were off, and the figure was standing in the middle of the road. I don't know how they moved so quickly, but there they were, silhouetted against the swirling snow. Their posture was unnatural, their head tilted to the side as if studying me. I couldn't make out any facial features, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and invasive. Without thinking, I hit the gas. The tires spun on the icy road before catching, and the car lurched forward. I swerved around the figure, refusing to look as I sped past. The road stretched on endlessly, the mile markers now gone entirely. I drove for what felt like hours, the snow growing heavier, my visibility reduced to just a few feet ahead. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again. Then, out of nowhere, a set of headlights appeared behind me. Relief washed over me at first. Another car meant another person, someone who could confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But as the headlights grew closer, I realized something was wrong. The car wasn't gaining on me. It was matching my speed perfectly, staying just far enough behind that I couldn't see the driver. I sped up. So did they. The chase continued for miles, the other car mimicking my every move. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I veered around a bend, they followed without hesitation. It was as if the driver knew what I was going to do before I did. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The headlights behind me flickered and went out. I sat there, breathing heavily, staring into the darkness. The other car was gone, swallowed by the snowstorm. For a moment, the road was silent again. Then I saw them, the figure from the sedan, standing in the beam of my headlights. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at me, their presence impossibly heavy. My hands shook as I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning as I backed away. The figure remained motionless, watching as I turned and sped off in the opposite direction. I drove without stopping for the rest of the night. When I finally reached the highway again, the snow began to let up, and the mile markers returned to their proper order. But the feeling of unease never left me. When I pulled into my driveway hours later, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the darkened street. The figure didn't follow me home that night. But sometimes, when I drive late at night, I see headlights in the distance, moving too perfectly, too deliberately. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for me to take the wrong turn again.